Judge Holmes smirked. He knew he would win, but Catherine placed a folder on the table. "A corruption scheme linked to your office, Your Honor." The courtroom fell silent. The judge turned pale, but what happened next destroyed his career and shocked everyone. But let's start from the very beginning. The heavy oak doors creaked open, and Judge Richard Holmes entered the courtroom. His black robe billowed with each step, and a condescending smirk played on his lips, as if he already knew the case's outcome. The air filled with tense whispers. Lawyers, reporters, and onlookers quietly murmured, discussing yet another high-profile trial. Holmes was a man in his 60s, with thick silver hair slicked back and sharp, predatory eyes. He relished power. In his world, people were divided into those who could afford justice and those who had to accept their fate in silence. He especially despised those he deemed too insignificant to be worthy of attention. Standing in the center of the courtroom was Catherine Wilson. Her strict but slightly worn gray suit fit perfectly, though the fabric at the elbows had begun to fade. She appeared composed, yet her eyes betrayed exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting too long without ever allowing oneself to break. On the other side of the courtroom sat George Carter, her ex-husband and a powerful attorney, dressed in a perfectly pressed suit with a self-assured smile. His voice had echoed in this courtroom many times before, and everyone knew one thing: he always won. Today he was demanding full custody of their son, claiming that Catherine was unstable, irresponsible, and incapable of providing the boy with a future. Judge Holmes lazily flipped through the documents and let out a dry chuckle. "Miss Wilson," he said without even bothering to look up, "do you really think you can handle this case?" A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Catherine took a deep breath and straightened her back. "Of course, Your Honor," she replied firmly. Holmes finally lifted his gaze, scanning her from head to toe with a smirk. "Well, we'll see," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I must say, it's rare to see people like you trying to fight the system. But I do enjoy a good show." Muted laughter echoed through the courtroom. Some scoffed, others exchanged amused glances. To most of those present, this was just another spectacle, a courtroom drama to be watched from the sidelines. Catherine clenched her fists, forcing herself to swallow the anger rising inside her. Her heart pounded furiously, indignation boiling in her veins. This man thought she was weak. He thought he could break her. He had no idea who he was dealing with. The proceedings felt like a poorly staged play, where all the roles had been assigned in advance. Judge Holmes didn't even try to hide his bias. He allowed George Carter to speak uninterrupted, nodding attentively at every word. But when Catherine spoke, he barely let her finish a sentence. "Miss Wilson, let's not turn this into an emotional spectacle," he interrupted the moment she began to present her arguments. "Your Honor, but I have legal evidence." "Save your attempts." Holmes cut her off with a smirk. "You're trying, Miss Wilson, I'll give you that. But unfortunately, the legal system is not a toy for single mothers." Muted laughter rippled through the courtroom. Catherine caught a glimpse of George Carter's smug grin as he casually adjusted the cuff of his expensive suit. Confidence gleamed in his eyes. He believed he had already won. He was used to this courtroom, this judge, and the certainty that the system would always work in his favor. But there was something he didn't know. Catherine was not just a desperate mother clinging to her son. In her past, she had worked in law, handling one of the biggest anti-corruption cases in recent history. She knew how the system worked. She knew its weaknesses and, more importantly, where to strike. She took a deep breath, suppressing her fury. Her time had come. "Your Honor, I have evidence," she stated, calm but firm. Judge Holmes, who had been watching her previous attempts with lazy disinterest, suddenly tilted his head. "Oh?" His voice wavered just slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "And what kind of evidence might that be?" A tense silence settled over the courtroom. Catherine let the moment linger, locking eyes with Judge Holmes. She noticed the subtle tension in the fine lines around his eyes, the slightly deeper inhale he took. "A corruption scheme linked to your office, Judge Holmes," she said clearly and deliberately. The air in the courtroom grew thick. For a few seconds, no one dared to move. Holmes froze. Catherine saw his fingers tighten around the armrest of his chair, his once smug expression wiped from his face. In that moment, she knew. He knew she was telling the truth. The courtroom stood still as Catherine Wilson, trying to steady the tremble in her hands, placed a thick folder of documents on the table in front of her. She knew this moment would change everything. "These materials pertain to a case I worked on several years ago." Her voice was steady, though the tension in the air was palpable. "It involves the bribery of judges, including you, Your Honor." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Someone dropped their pen. Judge Holmes, who had appeared unshakable just moments ago, suddenly went pale. The confidence, the smugness, all of it drained from his face, leaving behind a mask of a man caught completely off guard. "This is absurd," he stammered, but the mocking certainty in his voice was gone. Catherine calmly opened the folder, pulled out a single sheet and placed it on the table. "Then, why did your account in the Cayman Islands increase by $500,000 in the same year you ruled against my client?" She turned the page, sliding her finger down the bank statement. The judge swallowed hard. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. Reporters in the front row leaned forward, hanging onto every word. Several jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Holmes struggled to regain his composure. This is a lie," he burst out, but his voice shook. Catherine let the silence stretch, savoring the moment. Then, tilting her head slightly, she met the judge's gaze with a small, knowing smile. "Then you should have no trouble explaining it to federal investigators who have already received copies of all these documents." The courtroom fell silent. Holmes's breathing grew heavy. His chest rose and fell rapidly, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He darted a desperate glance toward George Carter, his trusted ally. But Carter wasn't smiling anymore. In his eyes, Catherine saw it. The realization. Their game was over. The next morning, the headlines exploded like thunder on a clear day. Judge Holmes indicted for corruption. Courtroom bombshell. Single mother takes down a powerful judge. Scandal in the justice system. How a woman with no connections defeated the elite. Newspaper stands, news websites, television broadcasts. Everyone was talking about the same case. Journalists scrambled to analyze the documents Catherine had presented in court. The investigation had only just begun, but one thing was already clear. Judge Holmes' career was over. He resigned in less than 24 hours. George Carter, her ex-husband, looked shaken as the judge, eager to escape the courtroom, didn't even acknowledge him as an ally. His carefully crafted strategy had crumbled, his position weakened, and he knew Catherine had won. She won the case. The court ruled in her favor, granting her full custody of her son. Carter's attempts to take the child away were officially declared manipulative. Now, standing at the courthouse steps, Catherine took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. It was fresh, clean, and it belonged to her. Beside her, 7-year-old Thomas squeezed her hand. His eyes shone with pride. "You did great, Mom," he beamed, gazing up at her. She knelt before him, wrapping his tiny fingers in her own. "I will always fight for you," she whispered, pulling him into a tight embrace. Passers-by glanced their way. Some recognized her. Others nodded in silent respect. Today, she had become more than just a mother fighting for her child. She had become a symbol of justice. Her story spread across the country, a powerful reminder that even against the system, truth can still prevail.